William, talk about this. This is like the concept of egalitarian constitutionalism, and there are three commitments that are associated with that. And it seems to me that it's not necessarily at odds with that idea that the Constitution is also sort of a check on government, because it's really government just happened to be the only concentrated power, and theoretically the only concentration of power in our society at that time. But it could be conceived of as being against all the idea of concentrated power. But tell us about the concepts of egalitarian constitutionalism.
So we need to rewind for just long enough for me to say that in this pre-Civil War era that we're about to sort of depart from to go forward, nobody smells like a rose, to put it mildly. We don't have heroes. Jackson ain't no hero from any sensible modern perspective. He, his coalition rested on slaveholders and the sort of emerging, smallholders, working people. He appealed at once to white plebeian guys who felt oppressed by the emerging new capitalist world around them, and to the planter class of the South, who for at least a time were invested in having a national party that welded together the interests of slaveholding planters on the one hand and sort of, white working guys on the other. It was a tragedy that, what was most visionary about and most militant in the terms of a broad distribution was a broad distribution for white guys that was understood by those white guys to rest on both, women's subordination and Black slavery and the exclusion of Black people from the political community. And the Whigs, were the ones who nurtured some of the, early anti-slavery thinkers like Lincoln. And eventually the anti-slavery thinkers in both parties coalesced in a new formation, which was the Republican Party. And let's be clear as well that there was massive concentration of wealth in the South as well. That's whom the Republicans, when they became the nation's first sectional party, gave up the ghost of a Southern Republican Party until they defeated the South and were trying to build up a Black base. But for the time being, they were the sectional party, and they said, we must, ultimately dismantle slavery. At first, they said, we'll honor it where it exists in the states. We must bar it from the territories. And we must put it on the road to extinction. And what we must also assail is what they thought of as the slave power or the planter oligarchy. Those were their words. This isn't just Joey and my saying, oh, there's a word that captures what's going on. This is a word and idea that we found, everywhere in the archives and literature of, every period, including this period leading up to the Civil War and its aftermath.
So I'm sorry to interrupt you, but to be clear, part of the impetus, I think people certainly, and we've certainly talked about this on this program, that people are aware that the anti-slavery sentiment both could be, it could be abolitionist and it could still be very much racist in many respects. But you're saying that that
either way they were hostile to the planters and they wanted to abolish slavery.
As a function, at least in part too, because they wanted to undermine the oligarchic nature of it.
Exactly.
It's the economic power of being able to own labor, essentially, that was also part of the impetus to get rid of slavery.
And they owned the Congress in a special way because they were overrepresented, right? The 3/5 clause, the notorious constitutional provision that gave, the Southern delegation, representation by counting slaves, 3/5 of persons, even though of course they had no vote. So the South, it's no coincidence that so many of our pre-Civil War presidents were Southerners or from Virginia. That was the hub of both massive wealth and an overbearing political clout, thanks to, some of what was baked into the Constitution. So the Civil War, and this takes us back to your question about what are the three principles, where do they come from? The Civil War Republicans and the Reconstruction Republicans grabbed this anti-oligarchy tradition, grabbed this broad middle class as a basis for a Republican government tradition. And for the first time, a major party said racial inclusion, bringing the Black slaves into the citizenry, is another equally fundamental principle for a decent republic and a decent reading of the Constitution once we put these new amendments in it. And what we've forgotten is those amendments in the eyes of these Republicans did more than civil rights and political rights. They also, this takes us back to Joey's point, they also enjoined Congress, imposed an unduckable duty to redistribute land, to educate, to provide the sort of social and material bases of Black citizenship.
And just to remind people, this is when public schools were essentially adopted and promoted, and a lot of this stuff necessarily wasn't exactly executed in the way that I think a lot of the radical Republicans wanted. And there was a lot of negotiating that was unfortunate in the context of the 13th Amendment, let's say, that allowed for certain loopholes that, and we see those loopholes, particularly in the context of voting, that come roaring back in what, we call the Jim Crow era. But from a legal perspective, it also becomes sort of like the wind up, I guess, to the Lochner era, and as we are developing. So let's talk about that. And we should just say that those three precepts, just to be explicit about it, was to check on the concentrations of these trusts and these both economic and sort of political powers, to distribute the economic opportunities widely, and to extend that opportunity across both, race and gender and other groups that were considered immigrants, I guess, on some level. And so we head into sort of almost like the Empire Strikes Back, I guess, era of the Lochner era. Joey, will you define what that means? Because this is a term that has come up on this program increasingly as we enter into a new Lochner era.
Yes.
And so better to have a law professor put a
Sure. Well, it's useful to bring some lawyers in, because one of the hallmarks of this political era that stretches around sort of the turn of the 20th century is the rise of the federal courts as an important player in political economy. So the story of this era, which we tell in a couple of chapters of the book, is one of massive economic transformation, right? This is the Industrial Revolution. You're having lots of workers in cities coming from the countryside. It's the rise of giant nation-spanning trusts, big corporations, the first great monopolies. And there's a populist and eventually progressive political movement on the other side saying these concentrations of power are too much. We need to tax this concentrated wealth. We need to create antitrust law to break up these companies that control, in some Western states, they control the whole state government, as in, Montana that we talk about in the book. And the idea was, the kind of axis of political conflict in America is shifting on a variety of fronts to being this conflict between the concentrated new large corporate wealth oligarchs and the kind of populist rebellion against them and in favor of the people. This is the beginning of the labor movement in the United States, and labor organizing was widely crushed by not just, employers and their often quasi-military, efforts to crush unions, but also aided by the courts. The courts in this period were staffed largely by judges who came from the kind of new elite corporate bar, which was just emerging at this time. And so really for the first time, the courts become a very big player in the fights about political economy that we're interested in the book. And this prompts populists and progressives to question in various ways the court's interpretations of the Constitution. Sometimes this takes the form of Article 5 constitutional amendments, right? So we have an amendment that says the court kind of very surprisingly decided that there couldn't be an income tax, and there was nationwide political organizing to put in an amendment, which we now have, the 16th Amendment, saying Congress has the power to do that. But there was also a broader political questioning of the authority of the courts and efforts to sort of, through statutes and through politics, to fight back against their vision of a kind of, this is to get back to your question, to get to their vision of a kind of contract and property rights are the highest rights constitution.
Let me ask you this, William. Was it, I mean, in retrospect, if you could have gone back and said, you know what, instead of pursuing a strategy of amending the Constitution to allow for an income tax, would it have been smarter at that time to simply say, no, you don't have the ability to limit the legislative, that the right to have an income tax is up to the government at that point. But by pushing for an amendment to the Constitution, there is almost a tacit acquiescence to the idea that it's not it's not the right of the legislature to do this, that it's somewhere in the Constitution that an income tax can exist, and giving too much authority to the court at that point.
It's a great question. And reform advocates argued both sides of just the question you put on the table. If we think that this interpretation of the Constitution's provisions about taxation, wherein the court forbids Congress from enacting an income tax, is both off the wall as a sort of legal and interpretive matter, and motivated by, sheer class antagonism on the part of the justices, then maybe we should just push right back. Others saying, no, let's instead pursue an amendment in order to, as it were, put an exclamation point on the authority of Congress to do just this, which stood for a much broader vision of redistributing wealth. So that already when the court teed up the issue, the dissents in those cases, right, said this gets the Constitution upside down, that the Constitution requires, again, this takes us back to one of Joe and Mai's, in some ways we see as one of the most important points in the book, a way of thinking about our constitutional contests around economic life and political economy as ones in which there are two sides, and the side that we're on doesn't simply say, no, Congress has the power to do this, but Congress must do this, and the court must back off. And so even in the dissents, there was a consciousness that we've lost, that not just the anti-redistribution side, which is the Lochner side, which is the side that struck down the income tax, but the pro-redistribution side saw their principles as constitutional ones, that our commitment to equal protection, our commitment to a Republican form of government, all required a new way of raising federal revenue, namely an income tax. So that it's quite a striking moment. And to come back to your question, I think I think no one on the side of the income tax amendment in the end thought they were legitimating the court, right? They thought they were slapping down a court which had gone way too far and putting into the Constitution a commitment to a federal government that can tax wealth as much as it wants. Now, of course, that's going to be brought into question if progressives retake Congress and there's a wealth tax. You can count on there are already many, right, old Lochner era style anti-redistributive constitutional arguments being mooted, in anticipation of a wealth tax, just as there are, constitutional arguments being mooted about every element of the sort of broad progressive agenda.
And we should say the Lochner era, we just say, for the sake of people should know that the Lochner case was really about, I think it was in New York State, limiting the hours of people working. Like, I don't know if it was exactly a 40-hour work week at the time, but
it was 60, but you're right. We should have put that out there. That Lochner itself was a labor case. All the great cases, so many of them, of the sort of Lochner era and then the New Deal era, revolved around sort of the sort of wage contract. Could state lawmakers in Congress rewrite put a ceiling on the number of hours, put a floor on wages, empower workers to bargain collectively? These issues that to some extent we've almost forgotten our constitutional ones were at the heart of it.
And just for the sake of people who don't know, this was the court saying that there is a completely, there's a sacred right to the freedom of contract. But it also is ignoring at that point and saying that two parties can enter into contract. There should be no outside implications on that contract, like you can only work so many hours, or there's a minimum wage, or you have to be over the age of 12 or the age of 14 or something to that effect. And we should say it overlooks the fact that somebody's enforcing that contract. And so that contract's not that free at the end of the day, because the government, of course, enforces it. And, if you have, and there's economic coercion and whatnot. So the